wall texture as much as we have it. I've been storing it. And so I'm using it as my third coat and skip it. Then we installed our drywall. We screwed it all in. And now we're ready to actually start hiding the screws and the seams. So this is called mudding drywall. So some things you'll need to mud drywall. So I'm going to show, I'll show a different type of mud, but right now I'm going to show regular sheetrock joint compound. This compound acts by the process of air drying. The other stuff that I'll use when I'm in the bathroom is a chemical process, which makes it more resistant to ever getting wet and getting ruined, which you want to do in a bathroom. Up here, this stuff, because it's water soluble, makes it so much easier to clean up and so much easier to work with. So we're going to use, and it's cheaper, and so we're going to use regular joint compound up here. I really like this +3 personally. I think it's just easier to work with, but that's totally an experience and time thing. So to cover seams in drywall, our cheapest is, and kind of a standard for taping drywall has been paper tape. This is like $2 a roll. It's very, very cheap. Paper tape is great. I'll show you how to use it. It sits relatively flat. There are 2 directions. It's really easy to use. It's really forgiving. There are some mesh tapes. Oh, I'm not going to be able to find the end to this one. This is a very thick fiberglass mesh. It's hard to hide. It's a very durable mesh tape. One of the problems with paper is paper can mold. So you don't want to use this in a bathroom, but everywhere else it can be fine. So in a bathroom, I actually really like this FiberFuse. Scrap of it here. So it's a fiberglass mesh tape. It will not mold. And it really disappears. I've had some problems with it cracking, but again, I think it's in my framing, which is my fault. Blame the framer. When you're the framer, it really sucks because you get to blame the framer. I don't think it's the FiberFuse's problem, but I'm about to, in the big house, but I'm about to experiment more with some FiberFuse. I'll be using this in the bathroom in here. There are other types of tape. This is a very cool corner tape. It's a corner tape that will not mold because it's actually not paper. It's a PVC or a plastic. I'll be using this one in the bathroom. And then there's the cheaper corner tape. This one's very beat up. It's had a rough history. But this corner tape, one of the cool things about this, let me just clip off the piece. It's already kind of boogered. Is it's got these metal strips that then fold, and they will hold my corner really nicely, and they provide a pretty durable corner, which unless I dig my trowel real hard into this corner, I can run it along this metal. These things are sharp when you're embedding, and it'll really hold up nice. So there's corner tape, there's regular wall tape, paper tape. This one's a corner tape. You can see it folds really, really nicely. It has this very nice fold. You can do corners out of paper tape, just regular paper tape, and I will be doing some of that. One of the things when I do corners out of regular paper tape, because I know corners where 2 walls come together and shift is where I'm most likely to split my seams. So I pretty much always run a bead of caulk in the middle of my corners. I'll show that later. Tools you're going to need. You could do all of this with 1 spatula if you didn't want to buy a whole lot of stuff. 3 different size spatulas will make it easier if you really want your stuff to hide, because this is first coat, second coat of mud, and third coat. Because when I'm trying to get things to hide, if I'm feathering all the way out this distance versus feathering out this distance, this is going to be a much more visible bump than this. And the trowels generally are not super expensive, and they're great for flipping pancakes. Not really. I don't think you should eat off these. But they do also work on concrete, if you're doing some concrete work. Let's see. Anything else? No, when I do paper tape, I like to get my paper tape wet when I use that. I'm going to show that here. Before I get started, things you can see here, I've actually put a little spray foam into this seam. because this is a big gap and I don't want to screw here because I have a piece of wood actually bowing everything out. So I'm really trying to avoid putting a screw through here and breaking out my drywall. I also noticed one thing you want to do before you get started is do a check if you have screws sticking out. Now is the time to make them bevel. These, I have a butt seam here. It's two, I haven't put the tapered parts of the drywall together, so this is going to be a really big, harder seam to hide. And because of how my layout ended up, I had to really toe screw these in, which puts them close to the edge and they stick out a lot. So this seam is going to take a lot of feathering for it to disappear. A tapered seam would be much easier to do. I'm going to just double check some of my screws. This one's sticking out. Bevel it behind. That looks good. I can't stick these in anymore because they'll blow up my seam. This one maybe just a touch. Okay. Other than that, we're good. Down there. Okay. All right. And then we're going to be ready to grab some mud. Okay. Mud. This mud should not freeze, and it shouldn't sit too long. You can see this is actually, it kind of looks like really stiff pancake batter. That's because this mud actually did freeze, which I shouldn't use, but I have it and I'm using it. It's froze very slightly. And I'm going to try and remix it. Try not to use frozen mud. I am being stingy. And this mud may have sat at the store a little too long. You can get bad batches of mud right from your hardware store. You'll notice I'm wearing gloves. This stuff, when you use it all day long, will suck all of the moisture out of your skin, and then some. So I'm kind of remixing this just a little bit to make sure it's actually going to get smooth. You can see it's starting to kind of look a little bit more like Play-Doh. That's much better. I think it's still good. I think it barely froze. I think I'm okay. I'm sure the company no longer warranties my work. Okay, so real quick, one of the easiest things to do when you're starting to learn mud. Ooh, I think I just disappeared out of video. Maybe I'll go over here. Oh, I bet you can see me over here. It's the problem with having your camera and no one can check it. That screws a little bit out. Okay. That screws a little bit out. Okay, so one of the easiest things to do to start to learn mud is start putting the first coat of covering your screw holes. See how that suddenly just vanished? So when I come in with my trowel, I'm coming in, I'm putting in this stuff at an angle, and then I'm scraping it back off. Okay, you cannot, if you put too much mud on at one time, it will just cause you problems later. So think more coats, less mud in general. You may or may not be able to see it. I have cardboard all over my floor. This stuff is water soluble and it will clean up, but it's kind of a pain. So there we go. I'm going to make these screws disappear. I will not be doing anything with this top seam. You know, if this was a drywall ceiling, I would put a corner joint here, but because it's a truss I want to show, I'm actually going to have a piece of wood trim here, so I'm not messing with that corner seam. Okay, so now we're ready to start taping this middle seam. So the first thing you do when you're adding tape is you got to put some mud on the seam to embed your tape. Again, like so much of what we do, if you wear nice clothes, you will be disappointed because it's messy. So don't wear nice clothes. It is water soluble, it will come out, but take my word for it, it doesn't come out all that great. Okay, so I'm actually going to start my paper tape just below this outlet. It's best if the outlets are uninstalled, so if you get to drywalling before outlets are in, that's wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and clean my outlet later. All right, so I measure my tape roughly where I want it for my seam. Remember, this stuff is really cheap, so don't be super concerned about making sure your paper is exactly the right width. You can cut it off later. Just cut extra so you're long. All right, real quick, when I'm working with paper, I like to get it wet. This is a trick I learned from the Fine Home Building Drywall Master. and then I wring it back out. I just think it makes the paper tape easier to work with. You can work with it dry. It's got a little seam facing forward and back. I have never actually found a difference in how I install it, making a difference, but if you have a really big seam, it might, because one section of the paper, the little center bead is facing forward and one's facing back. Okay, now I'm going to cut it off at the bottom. All right, lovely. Okay, to embed paper tape. So my tape is now on, but I need to embed it. I usually start somewhere from the middle. I take my knife, I'm pressing it up kind of at a 45 to really push the paper down and get the mud behind it. So you're going to see where I'm going to get my outlet dirty. Okay, I've just pulled out the mud behind it. I put it back in my tray. I'm going to do the same thing down because I want the paper to stay put. If I start just at the bottom, I'll probably roll it up. Okay, and then I got to get this. This is why you want to install outlets. I'm sticking a knife near live prongs. If you're going to leave your outlets in and you're not filming and don't need your cell phone turned on, then turn off the power. So if you stick your metal putty knife and you make contact with your two outlets, you don't zap yourself. It makes for a very frustrating day. So turn your power off if you're leaving your outlets in and you're likely to be sticking a palette knife near that. I am risking it because I need to run a video camera, but I'm being well aware of the risk. All right, so I'm taking this all the way to the floor, which is annoying because it gets really tight down there. All right. Okay. And then I am just bringing my palette knife across and smoothing out any mud that's kind of hanging out here. Because anything that isn't beveled is going to show up in my final... I just caught my paper tape at the bottom, which is why you have to be careful. There we go. All right, let me smooth you back out. Okay, and at some point I gotta stop working with this because this paper tape is vulnerable and it needs to dry. So one of the downsides, I see stop working with it and then I keep touching it. Very neurotic like that. Okay, one of the downsides of paper tape and regular air drying mud is I now have to wait a fairly long time for this to dry. Depending on your climate, you're probably not coming back to your first tape seams until tomorrow. If you're using the chemically cured mud, the hot mud or the fast set, you buy it in different time frames it'll set up. It'll say like fast set 90, which is 90 minutes until it's dry, which is usually roughly accurate. That if you are on a deadline and you're working on a weekend, or it's somewhere that's really, really humid, or you really just want to do a whole lot, you're doing a small project and you want to get all the drywall done at once, fast set is a great option. That being said, it's a chemically curing process, so you got to clean your tools up right away. You cannot let them sit. It's not water soluble, so you have to be a lot more conscious of your cleanup and everything. I'm going to be doing a lot of seams, so I am good, except for the bathroom, with using just regular air drying mud joint compound. I want air drying joint compound. I'm using mud and joint compound interchangeably. It is an interchangeable term in the drywall world. I will probably be able to put a second coat on these screws today because you can see it's drying really fast. It's very, very thin. I might be able to do this seam this evening or this late this afternoon, and I might not. But the second coat that goes on, that I put on to start hiding it, will use the next biggest knife, and the third coat will use the biggest knife. Because that's beveling the seam this whole distance, which makes it harder to see where that seam is. It's really rounding this whole thing out. So that will be second coat, this will be third coat. Okay, so on our drywall, we've put on the second coat of mud. So we put our first thing of mud, we embedded our tape, we let everything dry, we then put on the second coat, and then we put a second coat. This is the taped corner, this is the tape seam, this is over my screw holes. So I did a full strip across my screw holes just to make it all blend. And now between this and the third coat, we're going to want to go ahead and do a sanding. Because as you can see, there's a bunch of, well, maybe you can see in the video, but there's a bunch of lines here. And there's little burbles. Our third coat is kind of the final coat we want to put on ideally, unless we're doing a skim coat, across the whole thing, which I may or may not do for this project. You're either probably, if you want your drywall seams to hide, you're either probably adding texture or you're adding a skim coat, one of the two. But between second and third coat, we really need to make sure that we're giving ourselves the best possible chance with this big trowel to have a really smooth run. And the easiest way we do that is to actually sand this down. So in a non-COVID world, I would have some really nice N95 masks with breathers. Those really aren't available to me anymore. So I'm putting on whatever mask I have available because this stuff is not amazing to breathe. And then I love these little, I really like the small drywall corner sponges. Yeah, detailed area drywall. And this one's fine. I like the fine sponges because I'm usually pretty smooth, but if you have a lot of texture left that you're gonna do a ton of sanding, you're gonna want a medium. Things you wanna remember, you have tape under here. Like in these corners, you worked hard to actually keep this stuff intact. Don't oversand. And if you oversand, like, oh, that's just a different colored mud. If you oversand, remember you're gonna be putting mud back on. The great thing about drywall, you mess it up, redo it. It's very forgiving in that respect. So one of the things I like to do is I like to make sure my edges are beveled first. Take out all these globules because that's what you're really going to see is feathering from the flat drywall across the seam. And I usually just take my hand and I feel like, oh, how does that feel? Is that feathering? Okay. Try not to oversand your drywall. Let me use this piece of drywall. Remember, this is paper. I'm using one of my old sponges. Oh, look, that's pretty thick. Okay. See how I just exposed through the coating covering this drywall? In particular, this is the blue board, which is the mold protection coat in the bathroom. So try not to oversand to where you're exposing the inner side of your drywall. You're trying to the best of your ability, not do that. Cool things that this sponge, these angled sponges, they allow you to get into the corner really nicely. And anywhere tough, and yeah. So this seam and the side of this is ready for my third coat. Oh, almost. I'm gonna be going through and caulking this seam when I'm done on my third coat. This whole edge is getting caulked, so I'm not worried about it. So yeah, that's drywall sanding. So I'm doing an outside corner here, and I know it's split right at the doorway, but that's sort of how my seams worked out. And I'm doing the paper tape with the metal, embedding it, pushing the mud out, and that's first coat there. On the lower parts, on the seam that I'm working on right now, I'm using a metal corner. Anywhere that you're likely to hit your doorways, metal corners are a good idea. So I'll put mud on, I'll embed this metal corner, and then I'm gonna come back and put screws all through that metal corner. After that all dries, I will come back and I will put paper tape, or since I'm near the bathroom, I might be using a fiber tape, on either side of that metal corner. Then it's third coat time, or third coat plus skim coat, or third coat plus texture. And you'll do the texture after everything dries. I often combine third coat and skim coat if I'm working fast. But this is where your walls start to look as good as they're gonna look. Thanks for sticking with us. This is a long video, but drywall can be a long process, but it's very doable, it's very forgiving, and you can do it over and over again until you achieve the result you want. Okay, so I'm gonna try and move slowly. All right. So here we are, we're in theory a week from finishing. This is the second coat of mud I put on these seams, and guess what? My seam exploded. So this is what I was saying about it doesn't really matter what you do with drywall, as sometimes you are going to blow seams because of the framing. Here's what I think has happened, without being able to tell you exactly what. I'll try and back up a little bit. So we're right above a big window. There's a header right there. And then this paper tape, this drywall joint ended up had a 2x6 that loaded right on top of the header that's right on the edge of a window seam. These are prime spots for blowing. And so ideally I would have actually had the drywall I would have had an L-shaped piece that went essentially up, over, and across. And so there'd be no seam here. I went ahead and was as frugal with my drywall as possible, and I put the seam right at the window joint, which I knew would make it weak, and it did, and it popped. So now my next technique is going to be, I'm actually going to take some fiber tape, some of that fiberglass tape, and I'm actually going to retape over this seam one more time. So I'm going to put a first coat of mud here, and then I'm going to put the tape in, embed it, then put a second coat of mud there, and then after that, if this seam keeps blowing, I have probably screwed up in the framing department or in ending my drywall seam at what I knew was a weak point. And I'm going to put a piece of wood trim there because life goes on and I'm not going to be able to keep that closed. All right. And, you know, it's a bummer to walk into your building a week before you're supposed to be done and have that happen. And that's building life. Come up with different plans.